know when that's happening and when
Okay.
you're ready to mute us all and all that kind of stuff and get us going.
Yes, sir. YouTube is getting ready. I can see this little red line going across my screen. There we go. Okay.
Hey, Nick. Hey, Nick.
Okay.
And hey, Penny.
Happy
All right, sir. Let
Wednesday.
me get mute all done.
And you.
No, no. It was so much more fun when you had me interrupting. Anyway, yes, me too.
Okay, welcome everyone to our session number 8 on the Torah as part of Messiah's Comprehensive Bible Study. I included in the handout, of course, a lot of summary of what we've had from the past sessions. Of course, starting primarily with our guiding scriptures there, 2 Timothy 3:16 and then Hebrews 4:12, just to let us know that we do have to continually keep interpreting the scriptures, to asking God for guidance in how to interpret them. We went over a lot of that in the first session and indicated there what I was going to try to focus on during this course would be some themes of election, covenant, and grace. And we started with Genesis, of course, as the first of the books of the Torah, and the creation, where God basically created people, selected us, and made covenant with us. Uh, Lots of covenants with Abraham, lots of promises, promises kept, and with Abraham's descendants, and how Joseph appeared to be in pretty bad straits when he was sold as a slave, but he was just going ahead of the rest of the family to save them all during a time of famine. And God intended it for good, he said. However, things quickly turned around over, I say quickly, over 400 years. And by that time, the Israelites were slaves in Egypt and were seeking relief. And God again saved Moses and elected Moses to be a leader and called Moses to lead the people out of Egypt, which was rather difficult at first in talking with Pharaoh, but God displayed a lot of his mighty power, and eventually the Israelites were freed. And they instituted the Feast of Passover to remember God's grace in freeing them from slavery. In the second part of the book of Exodus, they started to hear a lot of laws, guidance for the community on how to live together, how to live in relationship with God, the first four of the Ten Commandments, and then how to live in relationship with others in the next Ten Commandments. We next went to the book of Leviticus, and we got an awful lot of laws in there, uh, which one of the primary ones was not to eat blood in the animals because the life was in the blood, and also to try to be holy. 11:44, I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy because I am holy. And so we got into what was holy, what was not, clean and unclean animals, got into prescription for practical holiness, the holiness code, which covered a lot of different things. And one of the important verses there, Leviticus 19:18, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against one of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And continued on with punishments for various uh, violations of the law, the feasts that were set up, how to go about worshiping the Lord, And so seemed like things were pretty clear. This is how it should be. Last week, we got into the book of Numbers, and finally, after all this instruction, the Israelites were ready to leave Mount Sinai and head toward the promised land. And as they did, uh, there was presented a priestly blessing, which again is very familiar if you were in Methodist Youth Fellowship. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. So the Israelites departed there and started heading for the promised land. They sent out the 12 spies to check it out. And unfortunately, they came back. 10 of them gave a bad report. God killed those folks off right away, but the rest of the people decided they didn't want to try to take over the promised land. And God said, okay, you've seen my power, but you choose to ignore it. So I'm going to ignore you, and you're going to wander in this wilderness till all the adults in this generation have died away. And at that, the people decided, well, maybe we were a little bit rash in deciding not to go. We'll go ahead and try to attack the land. And Moses told them, hey, God is not with you. Don't do that. But they did it anyway, and they were defeated. So they really had a time of it. And the book is just full of lots of different stories, many of them dealing with the grumblings, the rebellion of the people, the story of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, who revolted, and they were swallowed up alive by a sinkhole, and their followers were burned by fire. Later on, the folks were grumbling again, and God sent fiery serpents to bite them. And Moses prayed to God for some relief, and he said, okay, make a bronze snake, put it up on a pole. And if the people look at that, then they'll be saved from death. Also had the story of Balak and Balaam. Balak, the king of Moab, and sent for Balaam, who was apparently a well-known seer. And Balaam did not really want to go, but God said, okay, you can go, but only tell Balak what I tell you to say. And along the way, we had Balaam's donkey, who talked to him and told him, be careful to do only what the Lord says. So he said, okay, we'll do that. And finally, the book ended with a second census of a new generation as they were preparing to go ahead and enter the promised land finally. And among the final commands there, God said, do not defile the land where you live and where I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell among the Israelites. And so that's what happened there. And you think, okay, we're ready to go. But tonight's lesson is all about Deuteronomy. And they weren't quite ready to go. So for tonight, the book of Deuteronomy, the Greek name of the book is Deuteronomy, which basically means second law, two different Greek words there put together. But the Hebrew name is, I heard several different versions that I ran across in searching this, Debarim, and I've also seen Hadabarim and Devarim, which all mean words. And they seem appropriate because the book starts out, these are the words Moses spoke. And while the idea of the book being a second law also seems fitting, since Moses is presenting these laws to a generation which weren't adults when he first received the law from the Lord. Some think the idea of titling the book as a second law actually comes from the instruction in chapter 17, which seems to be forward-looking, but could have actually been written with a backwards look many years later. Anyway, in chapter 17, there's a commandment that when the Israelites get a king, like all the other nations around them, there's a requirement in verse 18 of that chapter that the king should write for himself a copy of the law so he will have it with him to read every day, so he will be faithful to the law. And we will hear as Pete gets into the history of all those kings that not not too many of them seem to have taken that approach to follow that commandment. Uh, and the fact that it is there is just one of the examples in the book of Deuteronomy that scholars are looking at it and saying, well, the book as we have it was probably composed long after Moses, even if it might be based on some of the things that Moses actually did write. Gets back to that point mentioned in a couple of other sessions where folks often would attribute things to Moses to give him a lot more weight, a lot more authority, even though they were being written at a later date. Many scholars consider the book of Deuteronomy to have been revised over several centuries by a group of Levites known as the Deuteronomic school of thought, which it's really kind of like other schools of thought that were present, like philosophy schools such as Platonism, things like that. The actual dates of the earliest and latest revisions vary from the 8th century before the Christian era to the 5th century BCE, and some scholars say it may have even been later before the final versions were written. Of course, the manuscripts, as Pete taught in his earlier class about how we got the Bible, indicated that we really don't have a lot of real old manuscripts to be looking at, old scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were certainly an interesting find because they were going back to around the time of Jesus or shortly thereafter. In the book of Kings, chapter 22, it tells of a high priest finding the book of the law in the temple of the Lord, which led to reforms by King Josiah. And that book that they're talking about, that book of the law, is generally considered to be Deuteronomy. In the New Testament, Deuteronomy is quoted 195 times according to the United Bible Society's Greek New Testament. And in Matthew, of course, Jesus, when he was responding to Satan's temptation, he quoted 3 different verses from Deuteronomy. And when he was asked about what's the greatest commandment, he quoted Deuteronomy 6:5. Overall, the law is presented in Deuteronomy, which is naturally called the Deuteronomic Code, is mostly more humanitarian than the covenant code that's found back in Exodus, since it seems to express concern for the least powerful members of society, such as slaves, widows, orphans, the needy, as well as strangers. As one specific example, Exodus 21:2 talks about a servant being set free after 6 years of service. But in Deuteronomy 15:12 through 15, the servant is to receive gifts at the end of that period, just as the Israelites did when they departed Egypt. So let's move on and talk about the main focus of the book, which is about God's love for the Israelites and instructions for faithful worship of God. The book consists of 3 large portions, which basically are speeches attributable to Moses. It has a little bit of narrative, some poetry, some blessings, and some closing material. And because it's all presented in the form of blessing, it's almost like Moses was giving the Israelites final sermons before his passing. His first address is contained in chapters 1 through verse 43 of chapter 4. It contains basically a short introduction to remembrances of some of the things that they've been through. They had the departure from Sinai, and I put in parentheses Horeb because in Deuteronomy, that's pretty much what is referred to as the Mount of God is called Horeb instead of Mount Sinai. Anyway, they had the rebellions and the failures along the way, the wanderings. They avoided the Edomites, which sounds a little bit different than the story we heard last week where the Edomites said, "Don't you dare come this way." So they went away. In Deuteronomy, it's God basically saying, "Hey, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, they're all your relatives. Stay away from them. Don't try to attack them." But Sihon of the Amorites was not a relative, and he attacked the Israelites, so God defeated him. Went on, also defeated Og of Bashan, and at that point, again, it looks like they're about ready to enter the promised land, but several of the tribes decide, we like this land that's on the eastern side of the Jordan, Gilead, so let's go ahead and can you let us stay here? And Moses said, well, as long as your fighting men go with us to defeat the folks in the land of Canaan, you guys can have this land. So finally, they're about ready, and you get into more in chapter 4 with some verses that really point up a few of our themes. That first one, 4:7, what other nation is so great as to have their gods hear them the way the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to him? To point out God's election of the nation of Israel as his favored people. We'll have a lot more to say about that in following verses. Of course, there is the warning in 4:29 that if they fail to worship only God, then and were scattered from the land, which again seems to be a little bit prophetic, but if the book was written, say, during the time of the exile, then it may have simply been recounting a fact that had already occurred. And anyway, even though the folks might be carried away into exile because of their disobedience, their failure to remain true to the Lord, 4:29 states, but if from there, your place in exile, you seek the Lord, your God, you will find him if you look for him with all your heart and with all your soul. And then finally, 4:35, you were shown these things so that you might know the Lord is God. Beside him is no other. And in this particular verse, you might think that it's reflective of a theology of monotheism because it is talking about the Lord is God. Besides him, there is no other. But scholars seem to think that at the time of these events happening, that the Israelites really weren't necessarily thinking that there was only one God. Instead, they were familiar with the calls for faithfulness to God, and so they considered those particular calls to mean that they should ignore all the so-called gods that were being worshipped in the land of Canaan by all of those occupants. So a little bit different take as far as the Lord your God is one, but we'll talk again about that with another familiar verse we'll get to. Anyway, Moses began to present all the stipulations, the decrees, the laws, They're called a lot of different things, regulations later on, whatever, that had been given out of when they came out of Egypt. And they might look a little bit different in Deuteronomy than they were back in Exodus or even Leviticus. And as scholars look at the laws, they say, well, they probably weren't a complete set of laws that were needed to really govern their society. But at that point, we get into Moses's second address. And of course, he's got to start that out with the Ten Commandments. And it's interesting that the Ten Commandments here in Deuteronomy are almost exactly the same as they were back in Exodus. Listed a slight difference there. Observe instead of remember the Sabbath, and by keeping it holy instead of keep it holy. But the explanatory language that's with that, the Deuteronomic code calls for the Sabbath to expressly be a day of rest for servants and aliens, with the reminder that the Israelites had been slaves in Egypt. So they should be aware how much these folks really need that time of rest. And also the last commandment about coveting, the order is changed a little bit. Back in Exodus, it starts off, don't covet your neighbor's house or your neighbor's wife. But here in Deuteronomy, the command is not to covet your neighbor's wife, as listed first, and then it goes on to say don't covet your neighbor's house or anything else of your neighbor's. So it's almost like there's a little bit more priority given toward women, even though they were unfortunately still considered as property at this time. Going on to some of the other verses there, that 533, walk in all the way that the Lord has commanded you. And it's got a promise with it, so that you may live and prosper and prolong your days in the land that you will possess. And certainly a big thing these days is the idea of prosperity theology, that if you do things right, you'll prosper. And maybe some folks would rely on this verse as being a basis for that. When you get into chapter 6 about loving God, this contains the Shema, which is really one of the most important texts in Judaism. The first word here is in Hebrew is actually Shema, so that's why they call it Shema. And the entire passage calls for remembrance, which appear in the form of phylacteries and mezuzahs. The phylacteries, as the verse is talking about it, are what you tie as symbols on your hands and on your foreheads as you're praying. The mezuzah on the doorpost of the house. And as stated a few minutes ago, at the time that this was originally written, it was probably more of an affirmation for Yahweh and the fact that Yahweh was the God of Israel, who was to be worshipped exclusively, as opposed to a clear statement that they did have a monotheistic belief, or a belief in one God, only one God. But the Shema has continued to be important. It was quoted in the New Testament in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Again, primarily as a question of what's the greatest commandment. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. And then, remind everybody about that. Your children, pass it on down. Teach your children the ways that they should go. So we move on through Deuteronomy. Chapter 7 is about trying to destroy the nations totally. And again, if this chapter was actually written at a later date, around the time of exile or slightly before that, then there probably really weren't any Canaanites left in the land for them to destroy completely. So it's more of an idea of avoiding uh, being lured into worshiping other so-called gods, as opposed to a command to go out and really conduct a holy war and kill off the folks so that you can occupy the particular land. Uh, the verse 6 of the chapter calls the people to be holy, and it's a definite affirmation of God's election of Israel as a chosen people. They're to be holy because God has chosen them out of all the peoples on the face of the earth. Of course, the next verses clarify that election was God's decision alone. It wasn't because of anything that they had done or uh, anything really that they could do, but it was simply because the Lord is God. And as stated in verse 9, know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commands. So, chapter 8 goes on. Don't forget the Lord. Verse 11 there, don't forget the Lord. Observe all the laws and decrees. Chapter 9, again, a caution to the folks that you've been selected to be blessed by God, but it's not because of what you've done. It's not because you're so righteous, but it's because I've decided to clear out all the folks who are in that land because they are so wicked. And I'm going to give the land over to you. But when I do, you need to follow my laws and stay holy, or else you're going to run into problems also. And of course, he reminds them of the incident with the golden calf where they worship that instead of worshiping the Lord. Chapter 10 contains more remembrance. That verses 12 and 13. And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I'm giving you today for your own good. And to me, that really sounded a lot like what Micah wrote. And I'll have to look a little bit more at the timeline Pete just provided to us today about the prophets, but some folks kind of indicated that, again, those revisions to the book of Deuteronomy could have been happening during the time of Micah. In Micah 6:8, Micah asked, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God, which again sounds very similar. As we move into chapter 11, first verse there, again about loving God, keeping his requirements, just as in Exodus and Leviticus, love God. Chapter 12, talk about one place of worship, which is really a new requirement. You would think earlier, as they're talking about the idea of worshiping the Lord in a tabernacle, that's something, but this idea in chapter 12 expands it a little bit and talks about eliminating the high places where they often worship the Lord, and moving all the worship to one central place. Now, as the story we'll hear in the future with Pete, the history as the people were moving throughout the land, taking it over and looking at this spot or that spot, and the tabernacle was located in different places. there was a lot going on as far as worship in particular areas, but yet the Levi. This gets into a little bit of the uh, background on maybe why the book of Deuteronomy was revised so much, and that's because of somewhat of a I don't know if you call it a spat or just a difference of opinion between the Levites and the priests who were the descendants of Aaron, because probably in the days when there were uh, before the temple in Jerusalem and even afterwards, especially after the split of the northern and southern kingdoms, uh, there were worship spots all over the place. And because of that, some of these Levites were essentially serving as priests in other parts of the country and were earning their keep in that manner. We'll hear a lot, I guess, next week, starting in Judges, even about that. If we get to Judges, I forget. I'll have to look at my itinerary class outline again for Pete. But anyway, it was a somewhat of a conflict there that if these Levites then were coming to Jerusalem, either as the kingdom was dividing and they wanted to go strictly to where the ark was located in the temple in Jerusalem, or later as the northern kingdom was overcome by the Assyrians and they moved to the south at that point. It was created an influx of different thought among both the Levites and the priests as to what to go on. Moving on with Deuteronomy, though, chapter 13, we've got more warning to not to worship other gods. 14, we get those laws again about what's good to eat and what's not so good to eat for you, as well as the commandment about tithing, which we heard particularly last week. Verse 15 sounds very hopeful to probably a lot of folks. We're talking about debt cancellation and freeing of servants and the dedication of the firstborn animals. 16, again, details about Passover and other feasts. In 17:17, again, they're looking ahead to the time that perhaps Israel will have a king. And verse 17, he, the king, must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Now, does that sound like a dig at Solomon? Because he certainly had a lot of wives. They certainly led him astray. He had a lot of silver. He had a lot of gold. And so if this was written even around Solomon's time or especially afterwards, might be appropriate to look back and condemn the way that he acted as far as exercising or over-exercising his authority as king. Chapter 19, we get back to more about the cities of refuge and about the idea of needing more than one witness to condemn someone. Chapter 20, they talk about going to war. And one thing that I'm sure Pete found interesting was that, well, if you're afraid, you don't have to go. And I'm wondering how many of his troops might have really spoke truthfully and avoided war using that particular line. Of course, if you were newly married, you got to stay home and make your wife happy for a year before you went off to war. I'm not going to say it. Chapter 21, they talk about what to do in the case of unsolved murders, methodologies that they came up with for trying to absolve themselves of any guilt. Talk about what to do with the captive women, the right of the firstborn. That again, it's talking about polygamy there. That if man has more than one wife, and he likes one more than the other. Uh, but the firstborn child is born of the woman he doesn't like as much. That firstborn still is entitled to their rights, uh, despite the fact that he might like the other wife better and want to bless her kids more. He's not supposed to do that. Tells you what to do with the rebellious son, which again is something that a lot of folks these days might want to do that, but we do not go that far. Luckily for me, probably. Uh, and then we get 22, some various laws. Talks about marriage violations in there. 23 through 25, we get into things that maybe would exclude you from the assembly, which was a pretty much terrible punishment. Uh, the idea of keeping the camp pure, because after all, God is there in their midst, and other miscellaneous laws. 23, 25, if you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to his standing grain. In other words, if you're wandering through, like Jesus and his disciples on that Sabbath, it's okay to grab a handful of grain to allay your hunger a little bit, but don't go out there and try to harvest his whole grain field. Same thing with the vineyard, that if you grab a few grapes to nibble on, that's okay. This idea is carried a little bit further with 25:4, even to the beasts that are working for you. I've always enjoyed this verse. Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. And in other words, let that ox have a bite every now and then if he needs to continue the strength that he's carrying on. And some of the ladies that used to be helping with funeral receptions and preparing all the food that's brought in as they're arranging it so nicely on all the many trays. Certainly, this verse would allow them to indulge a little bit, to sample what is there, to make sure it is proper and which sandwiches should go together. Moving on to chapter 26, talks about what to do, offering of the first fruits, the tithes, again the tithes, which we heard back in 14, and basically the idea to follow God's commands. In chapter 27, we get to a case where they're talking about once you get into the promised land. So again, is this prophetic, or is this something that was written after the fact, but written in such a way as to be talking about the future? When they arrive on Mount Ebal, which was actually in Canaan, on the west side of the Jordan River, then they were supposed to recite the curses and the blessings, and the tribes were grouped according to whether they were tribes of Jacob's actual wives or tribes, children of his wife's handmaids. So, just kind of an interesting way to group them there. They were supposed to write the words of the law on stones that had been whitewashed there. All of it, again, remembrance and keeping God first, worshiping God. In chapter 28, they talk a little bit about the blessings for obedience, but an awful lot about curses for disobedience. 28:2, all these blessings will come upon you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. Again, the idea of prosperity theology, that if you follow all these things, you're going to be in a situation where you get to lend money, but you won't have to borrow it from anybody. which is something that we hear as a theme throughout history of Europe as being one of the concerns about the Jewish people, that they seem to be these money lenders that have all this money, and here they are lending to everyone, charging interest to them, and yet they don't have to borrow from anybody else. So that idea of the blessing could wind up actually hurting other people's view of you. In verses 15 and then again in 36 of that same chapter, however, you do not obey the Lord your God, the Lord will drive you and the king you set over you to a nation unknown to you or your fathers. And that, for me, certainly raised a question that we hear a lot of times. We hear a lot of it in Proverbs. The men's Monday night Bible study is going through Proverbs now. And it's a question of, are the evil always punished? Sometimes it doesn't necessarily seem so. In the wisdom literature, the book of Job, Job's friends thought he was punished because he had done evil. But he claimed, no, I understand that the evil need to be punished, but I haven't done evil. I don't know why these things are happening to me. So there are still a lot of questions that remain for us. And when those questions come up, then that's certainly a time that we can focus back on God's goodness and the idea of God's election, that God gets to choose what God will do, and the fact that God is merciful and full of grace and blesses us in so many ways that we don't deserve. Okay, we're finally at Moses' third address in chapter 29, which is basically a call to commitment. And at this point, we're talking about renewal of the covenant. Moses is talking about how, hey, I led you through the desert 40 years, but your clothes didn't wear out, nor did the sandals on your feet. God provided. Verse 9, carefully follow the terms of the covenant so that you may prosper. Again, raises a question about prosperity theology. Chapter 30, again about prosperity. And this is the idea that in verse 4, even if you've been banished to the most distant land, but if you turn to God there, then God will bring you back. In 6, the God will circumcise your hearts. He'll get rid of all that hardness that's there that led you to disobey him, to worship other things rather than the Lord. And if you love, you can then love God with all your heart, all your soul, and live. And verse 19, I called heaven and earth as witnesses that I've set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live. And that's a pretty powerful statement from Moses. Choose life. And no doubt you've been hearing that in a lot of different ways over the years. And we finally get to the last section, which deals with Moses's last days. And in this section, Joshua, of course, is the person who's going to be succeeding Moses. Verse 31 there, where Joshua is encouraged to be strong and courageous. You'll probably hear that again starting off next week. And the reason being, the Lord goes with you. He was going to be going with Joshua. And here's a word that says, even though the book has been written in third party about Moses, it says, after Moses finished writing in a book the words of the law, he gave this command to the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. 31:26, take this book of the law and place it beside the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God. There it will remain as a witness against you. And that seems a little bit harsh to me, as opposed to saying there it will remain as a witness to remind you maybe of what you're supposed to do, how you're supposed to live, how you are to worship God. But instead it says a witness against you, that if you don't do all of this, you will be punished. And that could be written that way because, again, they're writing from the standpoint that if this is being written from the standpoint of during the exile, where they have seen how the people are finally destroyed as a result of their failure to completely worship the Lord. Chapter 32, we've got the Song of Moses, a nice long poetry section there. Proclaim the name of the Lord, praise the greatness of our God, and God himself speaking, see now that I myself am he, there's no God beside me. I put to death and I bring to life. I have wounded and I will heal, and no one can deliver out of my hand. And that carries back to the question I had earlier about, do the evil people always get punished? It seems like there may be instances where they get away with things. It seems like there may be times when bad things happen to good people. And yet here God says, I put to death and I bring to life. I have wounded and I will heal, and no one can deliver out of my hand. So I hope you'll, consider that verse a little bit in thinking about, how do we react to things that happen around us and especially to us, and do we turn to God? Do we recognize God's sovereignty? Or do we continue to have a few questions about that? Finally, in chapter 33, Moses, as part of his farewell speech there, blesses the tribes of Israel. Again, because of that possibility that there may be the strong influence of the Levites in the way that the book of Deuteronomy is written and rewritten. There are four times the blessings for the dominant northern tribe of Joseph than there are for the dominant southern tribe of Judah, which supports the idea that the Deuteronomic school had northern origins. So, some of the other tribes are just briefly mentioned with blessings, but here you have the Joseph, his descendants, especially the son Ephraim, the dominant tribe up in the north, and gets four times the blessings that the tribe of Judah gets from the south. And finally, we have the death of Moses on Mount Nebo in Moab. And I don't think the picture turned out real well as trying to copy it and send it. But this is Pope John Paul II when he was on Mount Nebo. And you can see him, of course, in the white papal outfit with another priest there pointing out to him. I think basically over to the left is the Dead Sea, and the Jordan is in front of them, perhaps Jericho, and then Jerusalem up in that direction, perhaps, that the priest is pointing. And again, there's a question about Moses dying without getting to enter the promised land, but God said you can go up on Mount Nebo. Even though the people grumbled against me a lot, you also kind of grumbled against me a lot, and you didn't necessarily always follow my orders, and especially with the idea of the water at the Rock of Meribah, that I had ordered you to just speak to the rock and tell it to bring forth water, and instead you hit the rock with your staff to get water out of it and said, must we bring water for you? So instead, Moses was sent up to Mount Nebo, got to look over at the promised land, which from this view didn't really seem too promising to me, but mostly rocky type territory. But God went ahead. He passed away there, and God took care of his burial. So nobody knew where he was buried, even though lots of folks archaeologists are continuing to search for that. And at that point, Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses, at least for a little while, as we'll find out beginning next week. One thing that is there at the very bottom of the handout is a website of the Bible Project. And they have interesting video summaries of various Bible books where they're kind of as if they were drawing cartoon style parts of the Bible as they were happening. So if you get a chance, take a look at this one that's about Deuteronomy, since we just talked about Deuteronomy. It's only about just under an 8-minute summary, I think, of the whole book of Deuteronomy, a little bit less than my hour summary. And they do have similar videos about other books of the Torah as well. So I think we're about finished with the Torah for tonight for this particular 8-week session. And if you have any questions about or comments, thoughts about the Torah or about Deuteronomy, would like to share them or ask questions, this would be the time. Hey, Nick, I see you have a question.
Hey there, Carl. No, just thank you for that footnote about the Bible Project. I went on there, the BibleProject.com, and saw that video of Deuteronomy, and I looked at several other videos, and it's really interesting how they present the various chapters and how to look at the Bible and a variety of other things. So thank you for that footnote. That was very interesting.
Okay. There's another endorsement for those of you who have not looked yet.
And by the way, thank you for your wonderful presentations over the past few weeks. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the kind words, Nick. Any other comments or questions that anyone has? Next week we'll be starting out with Pete teaching us about the histories. I wonder if Pete, you might like to say anything more as a lead into that particular course.
We're going to start with an introduction where we're going to talk about the comparison between the Hebrew and the Christian Bible. We're going to talk about what Holy War meant and the rules of Holy War. We're going to talk about prophets, what they were, what they weren't. We're going to talk a little bit about the gods of that territory and that time. You saw from the handouts, there's a kind of a geography and a discussion of the land. And we'll talk a little bit about the historicity of all the things that go on. We'll start with Joshua, the direct continuation of Deuteronomy, the week after that.
Got it all printed out, ready to go. Okay, well, if no one has any other questions.
One quick question, Carl.
Okay, Bob.
We're making the assumption that, since I haven't heard to the contrary from anybody, that everybody in this group will be part of Peter's class. Okay, and that, that's why it wasn't necessary for you to sign up again. If anything changes, please let me know and we can get you deleted. That's not a problem, but unless we hear differently, we'll make that assumption.
Okay, well, let's have a closing prayer then this evening. Dear Lord, we praise you this day. We love you, Lord, because you first loved us. You have taught us and you continue to teach us so much about love, about how much you love us, about how we are to love you, about how we are to love one another. Help our hearts be open, Lord, to receiving your love, to sharing your love. We've heard so much, Lord, about your chosen people, how you selected them, and because you chose to. And you've chosen each one of us, Lord, because you decided you wanted to love us. We just thank you for that, Lord. And we want you to help us as we greet one another, all those around us, and offer them the same love that you offer us. That love is so amazing, so powerful. It's displayed in the gift of your Son, Jesus. And it's in his name we lift this prayer. Amen. Amen. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank
Carl.
you. Thank you for all the work that you've done, Carl. I appreciate it.
Fantastic.
You're certainly welcome. Thanks. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.
Ah.